In any great story, there's always that moment just before everything changes. The air gets heavy, the light seems to shift. And though everything looks normal on the surface, there's a quiet, almost imperceptible hum of what's to come. To truly understand the shock that rippled through this crowd, we have to go back to that moment. We have to set the stage. The venue itself was a familiar one, a place where ideas are often exchanged, a crossroads of thought. The seats were filled, not with a monolithic group, but with a fascinating cross-section of people. You had young students, their minds still forming their core convictions, sitting beside seasoned professors who thought they'd heard every argument. You had local community leaders, business owners, and everyday citizens who had come out on that evening, perhaps expecting a familiar political discourse. There was a low murmur in the room, the kind of sound that speaks of casual expectation. People checked their phones, exchanged pleasantries with their neighbors, and glanced at the stage with a passive curiosity. It was by all appearances a standard civic event. The atmosphere wasn't one of high tension or brewing conflict. It was, if anything, polite. It was the calm before the storm. This is so often where God does his most profound work, not in the earthquake or the fire, but in the gentle whisper that precedes it, in the ordinary setting that is about to become a sanctuary for an extraordinary truth. The crowd was a tapestry of modern America, each person carrying their own set of assumptions, their own worldview, their own unspoken beliefs about how the world works. They were, in a sense, comfortable. They were in a space where they felt they knew the rules of engagement. They anticipated a speaker who would operate within a certain framework, who would use a familiar language, who would, perhaps, affirm what many of them already believed. There was no sense of imminent upheaval. But friends, I've learned throughout my life that when you gather people together, and you have a speaker who is willing to speak a truth that challenges the very foundations of popular culture, the calm is always an illusion. It's the stillness before the winds of change begin to blow. The stage was set not just with a podium and a microphone, but with the collective, unexamined assumptions of hundreds of people. It was a powder keg of polite society just waiting for a spark. And that spark was about to be lit. The silence was about to be shattered, and then he began to speak, and it wasn't a slow, meandering opening. It was a direct and deliberate thrust straight into the heart of the matter. He bypassed the pleasantries, the humble acknowledgments, the warm-up jokes that speakers often use to endear themselves to a crowd. He went straight for the foundational premise, the one so many in that room took for granted as an unshakable truth. He looked out at that diverse audience, and he presented an idea that was, for many of them, unthinkable. He argued that the very concept of the American dream, the idea of self-reliance and individual liberty, was not just being challenged from the outside, but was being systematically dismantled from within our own institutions. And he didn't say this in the language of a dry policy paper. He framed it as a moral and spiritual battle. He spoke of a great replacement, not of people, but of principles, a deliberate, slow-moving coup where the timeless values of faith, family, and personal responsibility were being replaced by a new secular creed of government dependency, collective guilt, and radical individualism that severed the soul from its creator. This was the ignition. This was the spark that landed on the powder keg of that polite, expectant room, because he wasn't just criticizing a policy or a politician. He was calling into question the entire moral framework that a large portion of that audience, especially the young students and their professors, had been taught was virtuous. He was telling them that their compassion was being weaponized, that their desire for justice was being misdirected into a philosophy that ultimately leads to spiritual emptiness and national decline. He took their core virtue, their belief in being on the right side of history, and he turned it on its head. declaring that history itself was being rewritten by those who hated the America our founders established under God. You could feel the discomfort begin to physically manifest. A statement like that doesn't just land in the mind, it hits the gut. For those who had built their identity on this modern progressive framework, it felt like a personal attack, a denial of their very goodness. For others, it was a shocking, terrifying confirmation of their deepest fears. And for a third group, it was a revelation, a putting into words of a nagging feeling they could never quite articulate. He was connecting dots in public that many were only comfortable connecting in the privacy of their own thoughts. He spoke of our schools not as places of learning, but as indoctrination centers for a godless worldview. He spoke of our corporations not as engines of innovation, but as apostles of a globalist agenda. He spoke of our government not as a protector of rights, but as an aspiring substitute for God, demanding ultimate allegiance. This was the core controversial argument. It was a sweeping, all-encompassing indictment of the modern American trajectory. It wasn't a critique of a single branch or a single law. It was a diagnosis of a spiritual sickness at the heart of our culture. And by framing it in such stark, uncompromising, and theological terms, he made it impossible to dismiss as mere partisan politics. This was a challenge to the soul of the nation, and in that room, you could feel every single person being forced to choose a side in that very moment based on the allegiance of their heart. The comfortable assumptions of the evening were gone, replaced by a profound and unsettling challenge. And that is when you could see it. It wasn't just heard, it was felt. It moved through that room like a physical force, a wave of pure, unvarnished reaction. It started in the silence. For a beat, maybe two, after he laid down that foundational, provocative premise, there was a vacuum of sound, a stunned, collective intake of breath held in 100 lungs at once. It was the quiet of cognitive dissonance, the sound of a worldview hitting a wall it couldn't immediately scale, and then the silence broke. But not with a single sound. It fractured into a dozen different reactions, all happening at once, creating a low, chaotic symphony of shock. To my left, a young man who had been slouched in his chair slowly sat bolt upright, his eyes wide as if he'd just been jolted awake. A few rows ahead, an older couple who had been nodding along with a gentle agreement now turned to look at each other, not with confusion, but with a deep, knowing alarm, as if to say, he's actually saying it out loud. But across the aisle it was different. A woman, perhaps a professor, let out a sharp, audible tiski of disdain, folding her arms tightly across her chest, her body language screaming rejection. A low, angry murmur began to emanate from a pocket of students, a sound less of discussion and more of protest, like the first rumble of a coming storm. And yet, simultaneously, from another section came a sudden, solid clap. It was isolated at first, almost hesitant, as if the person clapping was testing the air. Then another joined, and then a few more, building from a spatter into a determined, forceful applause that was trying to beat back the wave of disapproval. That was the most fascinating thing. The room didn't react as one. It split into its constituent parts right before our eyes. You could see people physically turning, scanning the room, looking at the faces of their neighbors, trying to find confirmation of their own reaction, or recoiling from the sight of someone whose response was so alien to their own. The shock wasn't a uniform thing. It was a social earthquake, and the fault lines were the aisles between the seats. A young woman a few rows from the front actually put her hand over her mouth, her eyes fixed on the speaker, a mixture of awe and distress on her face. It was as if he had thrown a stone into a still pond, and we were all watching the conflicting ripples collide and churn the water. The air, which had been so light with expectation, became thick, charged with a new and volatile energy. This was no longer a passive audience listening to a speech. This was a collective of human souls being provoked, stirred, and unsettled. The sound in the room was no longer a murmur of anticipation. It was the sound of a battle of ideas made manifest in gasps, in claps, in scoffs, and in the rustling of people shifting in their seats, physically uncomfortable with the spiritual and intellectual challenge being laid before them. The room was no longer a lecture hall. It was a living map of a nation divided. And as I sat there watching this incredible, visceral reaction play out across the room, a deeper truth began to dawn on me. The speaker, with his provocative words, was not creating these divisions. No, my friends. He was simply holding up a mirror. He was a diagnostician, and his words were a bright, searing light being shone into the soul of that audience, revealing the fault lines that were already there, running deep beneath the surface of our polite society. That shockwave we all felt. It was the sound of those hidden fractures suddenly and violently snapping into public view. Think about it. Just minutes before, this was a room of people who, on the surface, looked like a community. They shared a zip code, perhaps a nationality, a common purpose for the evening. They were civil, but civility is often just a thin veneer, a fragile layer of topsoil over bedrock of deeply held and often deeply divided convictions. What he did in that moment was strip away that topsoil, and what was revealed was the solid rock of two entirely different Americas, sitting shoulder to shoulder, each seeing a completely different nation when they looked at the same flag. On one side, you saw the faces of those who believed that America's founding was a unique providential event, a covenant with God that we have, generation by generation, strayed from. For them, his words were not a shock, but a long-awaited confirmation. Their gasp was one of relief. Finally, someone had the courage to name the spiritual disease they saw infecting our culture, our schools, our government. They felt seen. They felt heard. Their applause was a rallying cry, a signal that they were not alone in the wilderness. But on the other side, you saw the genuine, pained shock of those who believe just as deeply in a different America, an America that is fundamentally a work in progress, a nation whose original sins must be constantly confronted and atoned for. For them, his words sounded like a dangerous and hateful revision of history, a call to return to a past that was never as righteous as he claimed. Their murmur of discontent was a defense of the worldview they believe is compassionate, just, and enlightened. And in the space between these two groups, you had the undecided, the curious, the young people whose worldviews are still being formed. And you could see the struggle on their faces. A desperate, searching look from one side of the room to the other, trying to decide which version of reality resonated with their own spirit. This was the true power and the true terror of that moment. It proved that we are not a nation divided by mere policy preferences. We are a people divided by fundamentally different gospels. We have different creeds, different saints, and a different understanding of sin and salvation. We use the same words, freedom, justice, patriotism, but we are speaking different spiritual languages. The fault line is not political, it is theological. It is a battle for the soul of the nation, a conflict over which God we will serve. And in that room, for a few breathtaking minutes, the invisible war became visible. The shock was the sound of a hidden spiritual war suddenly roaring to life in a quiet room. But my friends, the story of that evening does not end at the doors of that auditorium. The shock wave that rolled through that room was only the beginning, because we live in an age where a moment of profound, local confrontation can be captured on a device small enough to fit in your pocket, and then launched into the heavens to be felt across the entire world in a matter of seconds. Before the last echo of applause and dissent had even faded within those four walls, the event was already escaping. It was no longer our moment alone. It was becoming the world's. You could see it happening right there. Young people, their hands still trembling from the intensity of what they had just witnessed, were already looking down, their faces illuminated by the cool, blue light of their phones. Their thumbs were flying. They weren't just texting a friend, they were posting clips, snippets of the most explosive statements. They were typing out furious captions or celebratory exclamations, framing the narrative for a global audience that had no context of the room's atmosphere, no sense of the tension that hung in the air. They were launching digital torpedoes into the vast ocean of social media. And the reaction out there, in the digital space, was even more immediate and far more brutal. The shockwave we felt physically became a firestorm online. Within an hour, the algorithms took over. The video clips began to multiply, to be sliced and diced, each version tailored for a different audience. In one echo chamber, the clip was framed as a courageous stand for truth, a voice of prophecy crying out in a modern wilderness. The comments sections filled with declarations of, "This man gets it," and finally, "Someone said it." It was shared with rallying cries, a digital battle standard for those who felt the same way. But in a parallel digital universe, the very same clip was presented with a starkly different headline. It was branded as hate speech, as dangerous extremism, a threat to all that is decent. The comments there were a river of outrage, of calls to deplatform, to silence, to condemn. The person who spoke was no longer a man on a stage. He was a caricature, a monster created to embody everything that side of the divide fears and despises. And then came the pundits, the talking heads on television, who had not felt the room's energy, who had not seen the conflicted look in that young woman's eyes, began to dissect the words from the safety of their studios. They analyzed the text, but had no access to the context of the spirit. They fueled the fury, they soothed the anger, they assigned their labels and moved on to the next story. But the conversation they started, that global conversation, kept raging. It was in the email chains around office water coolers, at family dinner tables the next day. Did you see that video? The shockwave had transformed. It was no longer a single powerful tremor in one location. It had become a sustained, low-grade earthquake rumbling through the very foundation of our national discourse. Its aftershocks felt for days, proving that a truth, once released into the world, cannot be called back. The echo of that shock became a storm that raged far beyond our walls, proving that a single spark in a room can ignite a fire across the world. So what are we left with after the applause has faded and the digital fires have burned down to embers? What is the lasting charge, the spiritual residue of such a moment? I will tell you, it is the sobering realization that we have passed a point of no return in how we speak to one another. That evening, and the global conversation that followed, was not really about the speaker or even the specific ideas he presented. It was a symptom of a much deeper, more profound sickness in the body of our nation. The shock revealed that our public square is no longer a town common where we gather to reason together. It has become a battlefield where we seek to destroy one another. The lasting charge from that night is the understanding that we are no longer debating policy. We are engaged in a spiritual war for the soul of America, a war where the weapons are words, and the objective is not to persuade, but to dominate. For those who agreed with the message, that night became a catalyst. It electrified them. It pulled them from a place of quiet frustration into a place of public conviction. They left that room, or they closed that video, with a renewed sense of mission. They felt a calling to be bolder, to speak up at family gatherings, to run for the local school board, to no longer hide their light under a bushel for fear of causing offense. For them, the shock was a wake-up call, a divine stirring to stand firm in what they believe is a God-given truth. But for those who were horrified, the charge was different. It was a surge of fearful energy that solidified their opposition. It confirmed their belief that the other side is not merely mistaken, but morally reprehensible, a clear and present danger that must be opposed with every tool available. It drove them deeper into their own camps, seeking comfort and confirmation from those who shared their outrage. And in the middle, For those who were truly undecided, the lasting effect was often a deep and troubling confusion. They saw the anger, the vitriol, the absolute certainty on both sides, and they retreated. The charged atmosphere didn't draw them in, it repelled them. It made the cost of picking a side seem too high, the risk of being wrong too great. So, the great divide widens. The charge from that event is the energy that fuels this great sorting. It is the power that pushes us further into our separate corners, making it harder and harder to even hear the other side, let alone understand them. We are losing the capacity for righteous disagreement, for the charity that allows us to debate the fate of our nation without questioning the eternal fate of our opponent's soul. This is the true danger. This is the lasting shock. It is the realization that the very foundations of civil discourse are crumbling beneath our feet, and when words cease to be bridges and become only weapons, what comes next is a darkness that none of us can foresee. The echo of that night is a question that hangs in the air, a question we must all answer. The question is no longer about what he said, but about what we will become in the charged and silent aftermath.